How's it going, American History 2 students? This is Mr. Bell coming back at you with another video lesson. This is day 163 of 180 of the normal school year, and it is COVID-19 shutdown day 35. This is your lesson for Thursday, May 14th, 2020. Let's start with the warm-up. NATO stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's an alliance between the United States and Western Europe that if one is attacked, is considered an attack on all. An attack on one is an attack on all is their motto. So like when we were attacked on 9/11, European nations such as England came to our aid. We are to do the same for them. The UN is headquartered in New York. It's the United Nations. It's an international peacekeeping organization. Their goal is to prevent war via diplomacy. Let's talk it out instead of fight it out. What is the UN Security Council? There are 15 countries who make the major decisions as far as the UN's concerned. There's 5 permanent members, the US, China, Russia, France, and England, and all 5 of those have to agree for the UN to take action in it with an issue. The Warsaw Pact is the now outdated, it is the now obsolete Soviet version of NATO. Is kind of misleading because those countries had no choice but to help Russia because they were taken over. So the first one is an international alliance between the United States and Western Europe. The UN's the United Nations. The third one is the 15 countries who make major decisions for the UN, the 5 permanent, the 10 that rotate in and out. And the Warsaw Pact is the outdated, now obsolete Soviet version of NATO. So we're moving on to Unit 6 today, which covers civil rights. Unit 6 is divided up into 3 different parts. Part 1 is civil rights, Part 2 is Vietnam, and Part 3 is counterculture, so like the hippie movement. You notice I'm starting with 6.2. That's because the stuff in 6.1 has been covered. As you see, that is the Booker T. Washington, that kind of stuff, different types of segregation. So we're getting into the newer stuff that we haven't covered in here. A lot of this is familiar because it's covered throughout your educational career. And I'm going to do 6.2 today. 6.3 will be coming at you later this week, and it will cover the high points of the civil rights movement. If I don't sound as good today, you'll notice I'm in a different location. My wife went back to work. The kids are asleep. It is like 7 in the morning when I'm recording this, so I'm maybe trying to be a little quiet, not my usual mic, and I'm not trying to rush through the material, just trying to move through it efficiently. So if you'll just please forgive me with that. So what sparks the civil rights movement? It is Rosa Parks. You've all heard of Rosa Parks. She is covered heavily, usually during Black History Month, although she should be covered a lot more than she is because she is the spark that lights the fire that leads to the civil rights movement. When she refuses to sit, excuse me, when she refuses to sit at the back of the bus, like, excuse me, might get some coffee here. Like many all African American patrons are forced to do during this time, she refuses to give up her seat. It leads to a big boycott of the Montgomery bus system. You know, boycotts not to participate in something, and it leads to them starting to lose money. She is arrested in Montgomery, Alabama, and it eventually leads to them changing their stance as far as having Black people sit at the back of the bus. Now that doesn't come too much later. So why is this so important? It's not like she sits at the front of the bus, then a month later they decide to let's fix this in Montgomery, Alabama. It really gets people talking about civil rights nationwide, and it kind of opens the door for people like Martin Luther King to step up and kind of take the baton from her and take the civil rights movement, not in a new direction because she had it going in the right direction, but to a much grander stage, like stuff Martin Luther King Jr. will do with the I Have a Dream speech. So Rosa Parks, I like this because you see Obama sitting on that same seat that she sat in, which is in the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History now. That bus is in DC. So who shall lead? Martin Luther King is the face of the civil rights movement. He's not the only important person here, but he defines what civil rights is, in particular in the late 50s into the 1960s. He has a coalition of people, black and white, who are willing to fight for the cause of civil rights and equal treatment among African Americans in the United States. Civil disobedience means peaceful protest, so he's doing things like sit-in, boycotts. He takes his inspiration from transcendentalists, who are peaceful people who were against slavery, and famous writers that you learned about in American History 1. Civil disobedience is also something that Gandhi used to liberate India from England when he went on a hunger strike. I know you guys learned about that in world history, so not covering that here. The types of things that King would do. He was a great speaker. He's a great orator. The most famous speech in American history is the I Have a Dream speech, where he marches on Washington and really brings attention to the civil rights movement on the biggest stage possible. He uses the church very, very efficiently during his movement for equal rights. He makes it a moral issue, an issue that it is not right to treat African Americans less than whites. Another group of people who are very influential in launching the civil rights movement, I would say, besides Rosa Parks, probably nobody else is more important and influential, as the Greensboro Four. They decided that they would not leave the front of the counter at Woolworth Diner in Greensboro, outside of North Carolina A&T, a historically black university. They were spit on, called terrible names, had hot coffee poured on them, but they refused to get up. They were arrested, they were injured, but they would refuse to leave those seats until forcefully made to. This caused a scene, it caused a spectacle, but that spectacle had a specific purpose, which was to bring attention to just how far racist people would go because of the color of somebody's skin. Martin Luther King is arrested several times. One of the most famous arrests he has is Birmingham, Alabama. And when he is arrested in Birmingham, Alabama, he writes the famous Letters from a Birmingham Jail, in which he basically writes to the future of America. It's almost an outline for the I Have a Dream speech. You know, the I Have a Dream speech, you know, he dreams of a day when white kids and black kids, I'm paraphrasing here, can go to the same schools and things of that nature. With the I Have a Dream speech, it's kind of the more articulate, the more polished version of Letters from a Birmingham Jail, where he's basically writing to the next generation saying, I hope we can do better. He organizes through the church. He creates a group called the SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conferences. They use the churches in the South, the African American churches, to organize things like freedom rides, sit-ins, marches, boycotts. Freedom rides were almost like parades in which people would ride through very racist towns. It was very dangerous. They were attacked often by the KKK and other hate groups and just racist people in general in the South, in which they had signs on their car pushing for equal rights and freedom. SCLC, founded by Dr. Martin Luther King, again, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. We just talked about the Freedom Riders and how they were attacked. James Farmer, he created the notion of the Freedom Ride. The purpose of the Freedom Ride was really to get Congress's attention, and it worked because it led to CORE, or Congress on Racial Equality. This was a group of congressmen, black and white, who met to try to figure out laws and progress laws far enough to make things equal among blacks and whites in the United States. Malcolm X, he is the other side of the civil rights coin from Dr. Martin Luther King. You have Dr. King, whose peaceful protest by any means necessary. You have whose peaceful protest, civil disobedience, and you have Malcolm X, who's by any means necessary. Use violence if necessary to push America towards civil rights. Now, as he kind of evolves, he actually comes around to the thinking of Martin Luther King late in his life. And he actually wants to march with Martin Luther King at Selma. We'll talk about the Selma March, I believe, in the next video lesson. If you see me looking away, I'm looking at the baby monitor here. Make sure the baby's still asleep. And he denounces violence. And this does kind of alienate a lot of his followers who are devoted to him. They see him as kind of turning the back on the by any means necessary cause that Malcolm X had inspired in the generation, especially in the historically black universities, black people who were very educated and who were in more the city type atmospheres. He really resonated there, as opposed to Martin Luther King, who really resonated in the South and rural parts of the country with African Americans. He converted to Islam, and later on he decides that he's going to denounce violence, and when he does, one of his former confidants assassinates him in Washington, D.C. Not too long before Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. SNCC, Student for Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, organized sit-ins and boycotts. Notice the key phrase here, nonviolent. They were a group of young college students who were more forceful than Martin Luther King, but they weren't quite to the Malcolm X level. Now, what ends up happening is this group becomes radicalized by a young, charismatic leader named Stokely Carmichael. And it leads to people like John Lewis, who were kind of the face of the SNCC, as it was called, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, kind of losing control of that organization. And they do embrace some more extreme rhetoric, and they never get to like any type of, I would say, killing people, but they do flirt with using violence if necessary, which was a big jump for them because it started out as nonviolence. Jesse Jackson joins SNCC, and Marion Barry was the first chairperson. Jesse Jackson, the Reverend, still around, big civil rights leader, huge person as far as civil rights in the United States. The Black Panthers. The Black Panthers are often talked about. They're mentioned in a Beyonce song. They're referenced in pop culture. They made a brief reappearance in 2008 during the Obama initial run for the White House, although that was, not the real Black Panthers. They were founded by a group of young African Americans from Oakland, the Bay Area, Huey Newton, Bobby Seale, and Eldridge Cleaver. And they weren't, a lot of people think this is the KKK for African Americans. That's not what this is. Did the Black Panthers use violence? Yes, but it wasn't their goal to go out and kill white people. It was their goal to present an almost militant face to the civil rights movement and just show, a lot of times carrying literal arms, that they are willing to fight and die and in the most extreme circumstances kill for their cause. But they weren't actively seeking out white people. In 2008, when they resurfaced, they were going to places in which people went to vote in the 2008 election, where they felt that African Americans were being discriminated against and being kept from voting. Sorry, I was seeing where we were at. The Black Power movement, signified by that one fist in the air, it really comes to the forefront in the 1968 Summer Olympics in Mexico, where Tommy Smith and John Carlos come in first and second. You see them there there's John Carlos, Tommy Smith getting the gold and silver medal there. And Black Power, all these kind of get rolled into to one kind of umbrella when you talk about civil rights, which isn't fair because they are all very distinct and can be it's early and can be studied in their own right. Stokely Carmichael, who was originally a member of SNCC, embraced Black Power, but he could never bring the fame to that movement the way that this public display of protest did. It alienated a lot of people in the United States, but it got people talking about civil rights. So it was a very, very important moment in American history and in the history of the Olympic Games. The Selma March. The Selma March was to march for the Voting Rights Act. So there's two different acts we're going to talk about next in 6.3, the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act was to ban things like literacy tests and poll taxes that kept people from voting. African Americans in the South, they were unreasonable. You would have to make 100% on these tests. It wasn't making a 59.5 and you could vote. Had very subjective written essays. If one word was misspelled, African Americans couldn't vote. So the Selma March, which if you really want to dive into this in depth, I highly recommend the Ava DuVernay movie, Selma, which we usually watch in class. There was about 3 attempts at the Selma March. The first was met with, go back by the authorities in Selma, Alabama. There was a very racist sheriff there. The second time, they attempt to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, and they are beaten. It creates a national spectacle. And then the third time, they try to march the 50-mile march. Bloody Sunday was the second time. That's where they were met with the most force, tear gas, batons, bullets, rubber bullets, but bullets. It is the third time when LBJ orders the racist governor, George Wallace of Alabama, to allow the African Americans to march through Selma, or he's going to send in the National Guard, that this attention is brought to the Voting Rights Act, and it leads to it passing in Congress, which is what makes this so important. Famous first as far as African Americans, Jackie Robinson, 42. He was a trailblazer in the world of sports, the first African American to play in the MLB. He faced intense racism during his time in his Hall of Fame career. Thurgood Marshall's the first African American Supreme Court justice. He was appointed to the lower courts by JFK, the Supreme Court by LBJ. James Meredith was the first black player at a SEC school, a running back at the University of Mississippi. Douglas Wilder is the first black governor of Virginia, and Shirley Chisholm is the first black congresswoman in New York. So that's going to do it for 6.2, which talks about civil rights. I hope you've enjoyed this video lesson. If you have any questions, please email me at bsbell@clevelandcountyschools.org. Wash your hands. Stay safe.